He remembered her voice from that night, soft but trembling. "You're not absent just because you're not here, Raphael. You're absent because you stopped seeing me." He'd scoffed then, pouring himself another glass of whiskey, avoiding her eyes in the mirror behind the bar. "Don't be dramatic, I.S.A. I'm building something that'll secure our future. That's love too, isn't it?" She'd stood there for a long moment, wrapped in that old cashmere shawl he'd gifted her on their 5th anniversary. The one she still wore even though it had pilled at the edges. Then, quietly, "Love isn't what you build when I'm not watching. It's what you choose every morning when you wake up next to me." He hadn't answered. He never did. Now, leaning against the railing, Raphael closed his eyes and saw her face, not as she was now, weary and guarded, but as she'd been on their wedding day, radiant, hopeful, believing in him more than he believed in himself. Back then, he'd promised her the world. But somewhere between board meetings, acquisitions, and late-night calls with investors, he'd forgotten that promises weren't kept with money. They were kept with presence. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from Vanessa. "The papers are filed. She's fighting back harder than I thought. Be ready." He frowned. He hadn't asked Vanessa to handle anything legal. But then again, she'd always taken initiative. Part of what had drawn him to her, he supposed. Ambition. Drive. A hunger that mirrored his own. But Isabella had never fought for things the way Vanessa did. She didn't claw or scheme. She simply was. Steady. True. And maybe that was why he'd taken her for granted. Because she never made him afraid of losing her. Until now. A sudden gust of wind carried the faint scent of jasmine, the same fragrance Isabella always wore. It was impossible. They were 20 floors up. Yet for a heartbeat, he swore she was standing beside him, silent, waiting for him to finally turn and see her. He turned. No one was there. But the emptiness hit him like a physical blow. Inside, the apartment felt colder. He walked past the dining table where they used to share Sunday breakfasts, now covered in unopened mail and legal documents. On the counter, a single coffee cup sat abandoned, lipstick stains still faint on the rim. Hers. He picked it up, ran his thumb over the curve where her lips had been. And for the first time in years, Rafael Almeida felt something crack inside his chest. Not regret, not yet, but the first whisper of fear. Because if Isabella was truly done waiting, what would be left of him when she walked away for good? But it was hers. And for the first time in years, silence didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like peace. She sat at her small kitchen table, hands wrapped around a steaming mug of chamomile tea, the steam curling like whispered prayers into the air. Across from her, her closest friend, Clara, watched with quiet concern. "You don't have to do this alone, I.S.A., Clara said softly, pushing a plate of toast toward her. "You've carried everything so quietly. Even your pain." Isabella smiled faintly, but her eyes were distant. "I'm not carrying it anymore. I'm setting it down. One piece at a time." "But court-facing him? And her?" Clara's voice dropped. "Vanessa won't come clean. She'll twist every word, make you look weak." Isabella set her cup down slowly. The ceramic clinked against the saucer like a heartbeat. "Weakness isn't staying silent, Clara. Weakness is letting someone else define your worth." She looked out the window, where a sparrow perched on the fire escape, singing despite the city's noise. "I spent years believing that if I loved Raphael enough, he'd remember why he chose me. But love shouldn't be a performance for someone who's already left the room." Clara reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "Then what are you fighting for now?" Isabella's breath hitched, just slightly. "For the woman I was before I started shrinking myself to fit his world. For the truth. Not to win his money, but to reclaim my dignity." A pause. Then softer. "And maybe for my father." Clara blinked. "Your dad? I thought he retired years ago." "He did," Isabella said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But he taught me something when I was 12. I came home crying because a girl at school said I wasn't important enough to sit with her at lunch. He knelt, looked me in the eyes, and said, 'Never let anyone make you feel small unless you've given them permission to.'" She swallowed hard. "I gave Raphael that permission. Every day. By staying quiet. By pretending his absence didn't hurt." Outside, a siren wailed in the distance. The sound faded, leaving only the ticking of the wall clock. Clara leaned forward. "Do you think he knows what's coming? That you're not the woman he thinks you are?" Isabella stood, walking to the closet. She pulled out a simple navy blue dress, the one she'd chosen for court. Elegant, understated, strong. "He thinks I'll crumble under pressure." that I'll beg for scraps of his attention or settle for half the truth just to avoid scandal. She turned, eyes glistening but steady. Let him believe that. It'll make what comes next even harder for him to swallow. Clara stood too, hugging her tightly. Just promise me one thing. What? Don't lose yourself in the fight. Win but stay you. Isabella closed her eyes, holding on as if memorizing the warmth. I won't, she whispered. Because this time I'm not fighting to keep him. I'm fighting to free myself. Later that afternoon, as she walked through the courthouse doors, heels clicking against cold stone, heads turned. Not because of jewels or designer labels, but because of the quiet certainty in her posture, the calm in her gaze. Reporters murmured. Lawyers glanced up from their files. Even security guards straightened. She didn't flinch. At the entrance to courtroom 7, she paused. Through the glass panel, she saw him, Raphael, sitting stiffly beside Vanessa, who was whispering something with a smirk. He looked exhausted, older, but still armored in arrogance. Isabella took a slow breath. And then she stepped inside. The room fell silent. All eyes followed her as she walked to her seat, back straight, chin level. She didn't look at Raphael. Not yet. Instead, her gaze drifted to the bench, where Judge Roberto Mendez sat, papers in hand, expression unreadable. Their eyes met. Just for a second. But in that second, something passed between them, unspoken, ancient, unbreakable. A daughter's quiet plea. A father's silent vow. He gave the tiniest nod. But beneath the gloss, her fingers trembled slightly as she typed a quick message. He's distracted. She's calm. That's not good. Her lawyer, a slick man with silver hair and a practiced smile, leaned in. Remember, Vanessa, you're the wronged party here. He promised you commitment. You believed him. That's enough. She didn't answer right away. Instead, her eyes flicked toward Isabella, who sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, gaze fixed on the judge. There was no anger in her posture, no desperation, just stillness. And that unnerved Vanessa more than shouting ever could. Because stillness meant certainty. And Vanessa had spent months convincing herself that Isabella was fragile, a relic of Raphael's past, too passive to fight back. But now, watching her, Vanessa felt a cold thread of doubt coil in her stomach. Later, during a brief recess, Vanessa cornered Raphael near the courthouse cafe, her voice low but edged with steel. You told me she'd fold, she hissed. You said she couldn't handle public scrutiny. Raphael rubbed his temples, exhaustion shadowing his eyes. I didn't know she'd. Didn't know? Vanessa cut in, stepping closer. You lived with her for 10 years, Raphael. How could you not know? He looked at her then, not with desire, not with affection, but with something colder. Disappointment. Maybe I stopped looking, he admitted quietly. But you? You never saw her at all. You only saw an obstacle. Vanessa flinched as if struck. I saw a woman who let her husband drift away without a fight, who stayed silent while he gave everything to his empire. I thought that made her weak. And now? Raphael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Vanessa glanced back toward the courtroom doors. Through the glass, Isabella stood speaking softly to her attorney, sunlight catching the quiet strength in her profile. Now I think, Vanessa swallowed, her confidence cracking just enough to let fear slip through. I think I underestimated her. Back inside, as proceedings resumed, Vanessa took the stand. Her posture was perfect, her voice smooth as silk. Mr. Almeida and I shared a deep emotional connection, she began, glancing at Raphael with rehearsed tenderness. He confided in me things he never told Isabella. He said she'd become distant, cold, like they were roommates, not spouses. The judge's pen paused mid-note. His expression remained neutral, but his knuckles whitened slightly around the pen. Then Vanessa turned fully toward Isabella, her tone shifting, subtle but deliberate. I never wanted to hurt her. But when someone stops showing up for their own marriage, don't they leave the door open for someone else to walk in? A murmur rippled through the gallery. Isabella didn't react. Not outwardly, but her fingers tightened around the edge of the wooden bench, nails pressing into the grain. Vanessa pressed on, voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. Isabella had everything: security, status, love. And yet, she gave him nothing in return. No passion, no presence, just silence. The words hung in the air like smoke. But then, from the bench, Judge Mendez spoke, calm, measured, but with an undercurrent that made even the bailiff sit up straighter. Ms. Costa, he said, using Vanessa's full surname with deliberate formality. Are you testifying about Mr. Almeida's feelings, or your own need to justify crossing a line that wasn't yours to cross? Vanessa blinked. I'm simply stating what he told me. Did he tell you, the judge continued, leaning forward slightly, that his wife visited his mother in the hospital every night for 3 months while he was closing a merger in Singapore? That she held his father's hand when he took his last breath because Raphael was too busy to fly home? Vanessa's mouth opened, then closed. She hadn't known. The courtroom grew utterly still. Judge Mendez didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Passion isn't always loud, Ms. Costa. Sometimes it's quiet. It's showing up when no one's watching. It's staying when walking away would be easier. He turned a page slowly. Please stick to facts, not fantasies dressed as truth. Vanessa returned to her seat, face flushed, her earlier confidence replaced by a dawning unease. For the first time, she wondered if she hadn't just walked into a courtroom, but into a reckoning. And across the aisle, Isabella finally looked at her. Not with hatred, not with triumph, but he avoided Isabella's gaze entirely. Mr. Almeida, the judge began, voice steady. You initiated this divorce proceeding on grounds of irreconcilable differences. Yet your legal team has also filed claims regarding asset concealment and emotional distress allegedly caused by your wife. Is that correct? Raphael nodded. Yes, Your Honor. And yet, the judge continued, flipping through a document. According to bank records submitted by Ms. Almeida's counsel, you transferred over $2 million to Ms. Vanessa Costa in the 6 months prior to filing. Would you consider that relevant to the emotional distress you claim to have suffered? A ripple went through the room. Vanessa stiffened in her seat. Raphael's throat tightened. That was personal support, not marital assets. Personal support, the judge repeated, raising an eyebrow. For what purpose? Raphael hesitated. She was going through a difficult time. The judge said softly. So while your wife sat alone in a hospital room holding your dying father's hand, you were providing personal support to another woman. The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They landed like stones in still water, sending waves through every soul in the room. Isabella kept her eyes down, but her breath came faster now, shallow, controlled. She remembered that night vividly. The beep of the heart monitor slowing, her father-in-law's weak grip on her hand, his whispered, "Tell Raphael I forgive him," and Raphael's voicemail inbox full unanswered. From the witness stand, Raphael finally looked at her. And for the first time, he saw not the silent wife he'd taken for granted, but the woman who had carried his family's grief when he refused to. I didn't know, he murmured, almost to himself. You didn't ask, the judge replied quietly. Then louder. Ms. Almeida has not sought punitive damages. She hasn't dragged your private life into tabloids. She's asked only for a fair division of assets acquired during your marriage, and for the truth to be acknowledged. Raphael's lawyer stood quickly. Your Honor, my client. Sit down. The judge cut in, not unkindly, but with finality. This isn't about legal technicalities. It's about accountability. He turned back to Raphael. You filed for divorce after discovering Ms. Costa's involvement with a rival investor. Someone trying to sabotage your latest acquisition. Correct? Raphael paled. Yes. So your irreconcilable differences began not because of your wife's actions, but because your mistress betrayed you. Vanessa shot up. That's not, Ms. Costa, the judge said sharply. You will remain seated unless called upon. She sank back, jaw clenched. Raphael stared at the floor. The empire he'd built, the image of the self-made billionaire, untouchable, always in control, was crumbling in real time, not with explosions, but with quiet truths spoken in a courtroom where no amount of money could buy silence. Later, during a recess, Isabella stepped outside for air. The city buzzed around her, indifferent to the storm inside her chest. She leaned against a stone pillar, closing her eyes. You okay? Clara appeared beside her, handing her a bottle of water. Isabella took it, fingers brushing against the cool plastic. I keep waiting to feel vindicated, she admitted. But all I feel is tired. That's because you're not fighting for revenge, Clara said gently. You're fighting for peace. And peace doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with silence after the storm. Inside, the proceedings resumed. Raphael's lawyer tried to pivot, arguing that Isabella had emotionally withdrawn years ago, making the marriage functionally void. But when the judge asked for evidence, emails, messages, witnesses, there was nothing. Only Raphael's word against a decade of Isabella showing up. At charity galas he skipped, at family birthdays he missed, at midnight calls from his sister when he wouldn't answer. Then, the judge did something unexpected. He called Isabella to the stand, not as a defendant, but as a witness to her own life. She walked slowly, heels echoing like heartbeats. "Ms. Almeida," the judge began, his voice softer now. "What did you want most from your marriage?" She paused, looked at Raphael, then back at the bench. "I wanted to be seen," she said simply. "Not as Raphael Almeida's wife, but as Isabella, the woman who laughed at his terrible jokes, who remembered his coffee order, who stayed, even when he forgot why." Her voice didn't break, but her eyes shimmered. "And when he stopped seeing you?" "I kept loving him anyway," she whispered, "because that's who I am. But love shouldn't mean disappearing." A long silence followed. Even Vanessa looked away, suddenly uncomfortable in her own skin. The judge nodded slowly. "Thank you, Ms. Almeida." As she stepped down, Raphael reached out, just slightly, as if to touch her sleeve. But she didn't stop, didn't look back. And in that moment, he understood. He hadn't lost a wife. He'd lost the chance to deserve her. Outside the courthouse windows, clouds gathered. Rain was coming. Sounded like a drumbeat. He didn't look at his daughter, not yet. But the tension in his jaw, the slight tightening around his eyes, betrayed what no legal robe could conceal. This was personal. He cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the silence. "Ms. Costa," he said, turning his gaze toward Vanessa, who sat rigidly in her seat, clutching her leather portfolio like a shield. "Your testimony referenced Mr. Almeida's claim that his marriage had become emotionally vacant. Yet you've offered no documentation, no texts, no calls, no joint counseling records to substantiate that assertion. Instead, you've relied on hearsay and your own interpretation of his feelings." Vanessa opened her mouth to respond, but the judge raised a single finger, calm, authoritative, and she fell silent. "More troubling," he continued, voice low but resonant, "is your repeated implication that Ms. Almeida's quiet demeanor equates to indifference. That her lack of public confrontation means she contributed nothing to the marriage." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "I find that not only inaccurate, but deeply unfair." Raphael shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He'd never seen the judge like this, not angry, not biased, but invested. And it unnerved him. Across the room, Isabella kept her eyes on her hands, but her pulse thrummed in her wrists. She knew that tone. It was the same one her father used when she came home crying from school, when the world tried to tell her she wasn't enough. The tone that said, "I see you, and I won't let them erase you." The judge leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the bench. "Let me ask you this, Ms. Costa. In all your conversations with Mr. Almeida, did he ever mention that his wife funded the construction of the children's wing at St. Clair's Hospital? That she personally oversaw the hiring of every nurse, visited every patient during the holidays, and refused to have her name on the plaque?" Vanessa blinked. "I know. Did he tell you she turned down a board position at his company because she believed family shouldn't be mixed with business? No, or that when his mother was diagnosed with early-stage dementia, it was Isabella, not him, who arranged her care, learned her medication schedule, and sat with her every Sunday afternoon reading old letters?" Vanessa's composure cracked. Her voice dropped to a whisper. He never talked about those things." "Exactly," the judge said, his voice softening just enough to carry sorrow, not scorn. "Because men like Mr. Almeida often mistake silence for emptiness. But silence can be the loudest form of love, especially when it's given freely, without expectation of return." He turned then, slowly, deliberately, and looked directly at Isabella. And in that glance, decades of unspoken understanding passed between them. The bedtime stories, the scraped knees, the quiet talks on stormy nights when she was a girl afraid of thunder. He had taught her integrity. And now she was living it, even here, even now. Raphael watched the exchange, a cold realization dawning. There was something familiar in the way the judge looked at Isabella. Not just respect, but recognition. A bond deeper than professional courtesy. His lawyer leaned over, voice hushed. "Do you know something we don't, Raphael?" Raphael didn't answer. His mind raced. He remembered Isabella once mentioning her father was a retired judge. He'd brushed it off. Just another detail in a life he'd stopped paying attention to. But now the surname. Mendez. Isabella's maiden name was Mendez. His stomach dropped. "Oh my God," he whispered. Inside, the judge stood, signaling the end of the session. "We will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. Until then, I remind all parties that this courtroom is a space for truth, not performance." As people began to rise, Vanessa shot Isabella a look, part confusion, part fear. But Isabella didn't gloat. She simply gathered her things, her movements calm, deliberate. Outside the courtroom door, Judge Mendez lingered, pretending to review files. But when Isabella passed, he spoke without looking up. "You held your ground," he murmured, voice barely audible. "Just like your mother would have." Tears pricked her eyes, but she nodded once. "Thank you, Dad." He finally met her gaze, and for a fleeting second, the stern judge vanished, replaced by the man who'd carried her on his shoulders as a child, who'd kissed her forehead before her wedding, who'd always told her, "Stand tall, even when the world tries to make you small." Down the hall, Raphael stood frozen, watching them. He hadn't just underestimated Isabella. Paced his penthouse all night, replaying every glance, every word, every silence between Isabella and the judge. The truth now sat heavy in his chest like a stone. He'd been judged not just by the law, but by the man who raised the woman he failed. He arrived early, hoping to speak to Isabella before proceedings began. But she was already seated, back straight, hands folded, eyes fixed on the bench. She didn't look at him. Not out of spite, but because she no longer needed to. Vanessa entered moments later, her usual confidence replaced by a brittle tension. She avoided eye contact with everyone, clutching a new set of documents, desperate to regain control. At precisely 9 a.m., Judge Mendez entered. The room rose as one. But this time, his presence carried a different weight, not just authority but resolve. "Be seated," he said, voice calm but edged with steel. "We will begin with final testimonies." Raphael's lawyer stood immediately. "Your Honor, given the personal connection now revealed between you and Ms. Almeida, we respectfully request a recusal." A murmur swept through the gallery. The judge didn't flinch. "My daughter has not asked for special treatment. She has asked only for fairness. And I have upheld that standard without deviation." He looked directly at Raphael. "If you believed my judgment was compromised, you should have raised this before testimony began, not after it became inconvenient." Raphael's throat tightened. He knew the judge was right. He'd been so focused on winning, he hadn't considered the cost of losing with dignity. Then, unexpectedly, Isabella rose. "Your Honor," she said, voice clear and steady, "I waive any claim to conflict of interest. My father has been more impartial than anyone in this room. He hasn't defended me, he's defended the truth." The words hung in the air, simple yet devastating. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably. Even Raphael's lawyer looked down at his notes, chastened. The judge gave a single nod. "Thank you, Ms. Almeida. Please be seated." What followed was a slow unraveling. Vanessa's lawyer called a private investigator to testify about alleged secret accounts Isabella had supposedly opened. But when cross-examined, the investigator admitted the evidence was circumstantial, based on a single unverified tip from an anonymous source. Then came the turning point. Isabella's attorney played a voicemail, recorded 3 months prior, during a heated argument between Raphael and Vanessa. "You think I don't know you're using me?" Raphael's voice crackled through the speaker. "You wanted access to my portfolio, not my heart. Don't pretend otherwise." Vanessa's face drained of color. The judge listened silently, then turned to her. "Did you, or did you not, share confidential details of Mr. Almeida's business dealings with Eduardo Rios, the investor currently under federal investigation for market manipulation?" Vanessa's lips parted, but no sound came out. "I'll take your silence as confirmation," the judge said coolly. "Bailiff, please note that for the record." Raphael stared at her, betrayal flashing in his eyes. "You told him about the Singapore deal?" Vanessa finally spoke, voice trembling. "I didn't think it mattered. You were going to leave her anyway. But you lied to me," Raphael said, voice hollow. "About everything." From the bench, Judge Mendez watched them both, not with triumph, but with sorrow. "This courtroom was never about punishing Ms. Almeida," he said quietly. "It was about exposing what happens when people confuse ambition with love and convenience with loyalty." He turned to Isabella. "Ms. Almeida, do you wish to make a final statement before I deliberate?" She stood slowly, looked at Raphael, then at Vanessa, then at her father. "I don't want his money," she said. "I don't want revenge. I just want to walk away knowing I didn't become someone I wouldn't recognize in the mirror." She paused, voice softening. "And I hope they both find a way to do the same." Silence. Even the clock seemed to stop ticking. Judge Mendez exhaled slowly, as if releasing a burden he'd carried for years. "Court is adjourned for deliberation. We will reconvene in 1 hour." As people filed out, Raphael remained seated, staring at his hands. The same hands that signed billion-dollar deals but couldn't hold onto the one person who never asked for anything but his presence. Down the hall, Isabella stepped outside into the courtyard, rain beginning to fall softly around her. She closed her eyes, letting the cool drops wash over her face. For the first time in years, she felt light. Not because she'd won. Bench. She didn't look at Raphael. Didn't glance at Vanessa. She simply waited as she had waited for years. With quiet dignity, with unshaken resolve. Then, just before the judge re-entered, Vanessa leaned forward in her seat, voice low but sharp enough to cut through the hush. "You think you've won?" she whispered toward Isabella, lips barely moving. "You think walking away with your little moral victory changes anything? He'll forget you in 6 months. I'll be the one rebuilding his empire with him." Isabella didn't turn. But after a long pause, she spoke, softly, clearly, so only Vanessa could hear. "I don't need him to remember me," she said. "I just needed me to remember who I am." Vanessa's smirk faltered. Before she could respond, the bailiff called, "All rise." Judge Mendez entered, robes crisp, expression unreadable. He took his seat, placed his glasses on the bench, and looked out over the room. Not as a judge addressing a case, but as a man bearing witness to human frailty. "Before I deliver my ruling," he began, voice steady, "I must address a pattern that has troubled me throughout these proceedings." He turned slightly toward Vanessa. "Ms. Costa, during your initial testimony, you claimed Ms. Almeida showed no emotional investment in her marriage. You described her as passive, detached, even indifferent." He paused, opened a file. "Yet yesterday, under oath, you admitted you never once met Ms. Almeida before this case. You never attended a single family gathering. Never spoke to her friends. Never saw her in private moments." His gaze sharpened. "So how, then, can you claim to know the state of her heart?" Vanessa opened her mouth, but no words came. "It is one thing to misunderstand love," the judge continued, his tone lowering, almost sorrowful. "It is another to weaponize that misunderstanding in a court of law." Then, without warning, he turned fully to Isabella. "Ms. Almeida," he said, "during your marriage, did you ever confront Mr. Almeida about his emotional absence?" Isabella hesitated, just a breath. Then, "Yes. Many times. Quietly. Gently. I didn't want to shame him. I wanted to save us." "And how did he respond?" She looked down briefly, then back up, eyes glistening but dry. "He'd promised to change. Then disappear again into meetings, deals, silence. Eventually, I stopped asking. Not because I stopped caring. Because I realized love shouldn't require begging." A murmur rippled through the room. From the corner of her eye, Isabella saw Raphael flinch. The judge nodded slowly. Then, with deliberate calm, he turned back to Vanessa. "You called her weak for not fighting louder. But true strength isn't in shouting. It's in choosing not to become what hurt you." He leaned forward slightly, voice dropping to a near-intimate register that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "You attacked her character not because she deserved it, but because you needed to believe your betrayal was justified. That if she was cold, then your warmth mattered. If she was absent, then your presence meant something." Vanessa's hands trembled in her lap. "But here's the truth you refuse to see," the judge said, his voice firm now. "She was never absent. He was. And you didn't fill a void, you exploited it." The words landed like verdicts before the verdict. Raphael finally looked at Isabella. Not with desire, not with regret, but with dawning horror at the depth of his own blindness. He had let someone like Vanessa define his wife's worth, while the real Isabella stood right in front of him, loving him in ways he was too distracted to notice. And now, in this courtroom, stripped of wealth, status, and illusion, he saw her clearly for the first time. Not as his possession, but as a person. Whole. Worthy. Unbroken. Judge Mendez sat back, his expression softening just slightly as he glanced at his daughter. One fleeting look of pride, quickly masked by judicial neutrality. "The record will reflect," he announced to the court, "that Ms. Isabella Almeida demonstrated consistent integrity, emotional maturity, and restraint throughout this proceeding. Any implication to the contrary is hereby stricken from the official transcript." Then quietly, almost to himself, "Some wounds don't bleed. They just wait." And in that moment, the attack wasn't just exposed, it was undone. Not by anger, but by truth. By the unbearable weight of seeing clearly what you've spent years refusing to see. Outside, the clouds parted slightly. A sliver of sunlight broke through, falling across the wooden floor like grace. The reckoning had begun. Spent holding herself together for everyone else. The weight of being misunderstood, minimized, reduced to silence, now named witnessed seen. Her throat tightened. She blinked rapidly, refusing to let tears fall. Not here, not now. But her fingers curled slightly into the fabric of her skirt, anchoring herself as memories surged. Nights staring at the ceiling while Raphael slept turned away. Birthdays spent alone with a cake she'd baked for two. The way she'd rehearsed conversations in the mirror, only to swallow them whole when he walked through the door too tired, too distant, too gone even when he was there. Vanessa shifted in her seat, arms crossed tightly over her chest, eyes darting toward the exit as if calculating escape routes. But Isabella didn't look at her. She didn't need to. The battle wasn't with Vanessa anymore. It never really was. It was with the ghost of the woman she'd become. The one who apologized for taking up space, who mistook endurance for love, who believed that if she just loved harder, stayed quieter, gave more, he might finally come back to her. And now, in this sterile courtroom filled with strangers, that ghost was dissolving. From the bench, Judge Mendez watched his daughter with a stillness that spoke louder than any ruling. He saw the tremor in her shoulders, the way her breath hitched just once before she steadied it. He remembered carrying her home from school when she was 8, scraped knee bleeding, tears silent, because big girls don't cry. He'd told her then, "You don't have to be strong all the time, mi vida." Just true. Now, decades later, she was both. Raphael sat frozen, his lawyer whispering something about damage control. But he barely heard. His eyes were locked on Isabella, the set of her jaw, the quiet fire in her stillness. He remembered the last time he'd seen her cry. It was 2 years ago. He'd missed their anniversary dinner for a merger call. She hadn't yelled, hadn't thrown things. She just stood in the kitchen, staring at the cold roast chicken on the table, tears falling silently onto the counter. He'd patted her shoulder and said, "Don't be like that, ISA. I'll make it up to you." He never did. And now, watching her absorb the judge's validation without gloating, without vengeance, just quiet acceptance, he realized the cruelest truth of all. She hadn't broken because of him. She'd survived despite him. The bailiff cleared his throat. "Your Honor, shall we proceed to closing arguments?" Judge Mendez held up a hand. "Not yet." He turned fully to Isabella. "Ms. Almeida, you've remained composed throughout deeply personal accusations. But I see it in your posture, the cost of that composure. If you need a moment," the offer hung in the air, gentle, fatherly beneath the judicial formality. Isabella took a slow breath. Then another. When she spoke, her voice was soft but clear, carrying through the hushed room like a bell. "I'm not crying because I'm hurt," she said, looking not at the judge, but at Raphael, really looking at him, perhaps for the first time in years. "I'm crying because I finally understand I wasn't unlovable. I was just loving someone who forgot how to see." Raphael's breath caught. His hands, usually so steady signing billion-dollar contracts, shook slightly in his lap. She turned back to the bench, chin lifting. "I don't need him to apologize. I don't need him to change. I just needed to stop believing his absence was my fault." A beat of silence. Then, another. Vanessa stared at the floor, her earlier defiance crumbling into something raw and exposed. Even her lawyer looked away, uncomfortable. Judge Mendez nodded slowly, his eyes glistening behind his glasses. "Thank you, Ms. Almeida." He paused, then added, voice lower, meant only for her. "You've done enough." Those 3 words, "you've done enough," unlocked something in Isabella. Not collapse, but release. The kind that comes after carrying a burden, so long you forget what it feels like to set it down. She exhaled fully, shoulders dropping just an inch, as if her body was remembering how to breathe without armor. Outside, the rain had stopped. Sunlight now streamed through the high windows, catching dust motes in golden swirls, tiny, fleeting, beautiful. And in that light, Isabella didn't look like a woman who'd been attacked. She looked like one who'd finally come home, to herself. The courtroom remained silent, as if afraid to disturb the sacred quiet of a soul reclaiming its worth. Even Raphael understood in that moment that whatever came next, the rulings, the settlements, the headlines, none of it mattered compared to this. She was free. Sure, signing contracts, commanding boardrooms, dialing numbers that moved markets, now lay limp in his lap, useless. He hadn't spoken in over an hour. Hadn't needed to. Every word Isabella had uttered, every quiet truth Judge Mendez had laid bare, had stripped him bare in ways no deposition ever could. His lawyer leaned over, voice hushed but urgent. "We need to pivot." If the judge rules against us on asset concealment, the prenup won't hold. We could lose control of the Singapore portfolio. Raphael didn't look at him. His eyes remained fixed on Isabella, who now sat with her hands resting gently on the table, sunlight catching the simple silver band she still wore. Not out of love, he realized, but because removing it would have felt like surrendering a part of herself she refused to let go of. I don't care about the portfolio, Raphael said quietly. His lawyer blinked. What? I said I don't care. Raphael's voice was low, rough, as if dragged through years of regret. She funded half of that project with her family trust. She never asked for credit, never asked for a share. And I listed it under offshore holdings to simplify taxes. He finally turned to his attorney, eyes hollow. I didn't simplify anything. I erased her. Across the aisle, Vanessa shifted uncomfortably, scrolling through her phone with trembling fingers. A notification flashed. Eduardo Rios, interview requested by federal investigators. She quickly silenced it, but not before Raphael saw. He turned to her slowly. You gave him the Singapore files, didn't you? Vanessa didn't answer, but her silence was confession enough. You used me, he said, not with anger, but with chilling clarity. You played both sides. And when it fell apart, you came here pretending you were the wronged woman. I was trying to survive, she snapped, voice cracking. You think someone like me gets a seat at your table without taking what she can? You never loved me. You just liked that I wanted what you had. Raphael stared at her, and for the first time, he saw not a rival, not a lover, but a mirror of his own hunger, his own emptiness masked as ambition. From the bench, Judge Mendez watched them both, his expression unreadable. But when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of finality. Mr. Almeida, he said, you entered this courtroom believing wealth equated to control, that your name, your status, your legal team would shield you from consequence. He paused, letting the words settle. But justice doesn't negotiate with power. It demands truth. Raphael swallowed hard. I know. Do you? The judge's gaze sharpened. Because if you truly understood, you wouldn't be calculating losses. You'd be asking how to make things right. The rebuke landed like a stone in still water. Raphael looked down at his hands again. Hands that had built empires, signed divorces, held mistresses. But never once held his wife when she needed him most. And then quietly, almost to himself. How do you fix something you broke without even noticing it was breaking? No one answered. But Isabella did something unexpected. She turned her head, just slightly, and met his eyes. Not with pity, not with hatred, but with a sorrow so deep it felt like grace. In that glance, Raphael saw everything. The dinners eaten alone, the birthdays missed, the hospital vigils she kept while he chased deals, the way she'd whispered, I love you, into voicemails he never returned. And worse, he saw that she'd known. All along. She'd seen his absence, felt his distance, and still chose to stay, hoping he'd wake up before it was too late. He hadn't. Now, the gavel hadn't even fallen, and he already knew. He'd lost more than assets. He'd lost the only person who ever loved him without conditions. And the cruelest part? She wasn't even angry anymore. She was just done. Judge Mendez stood, adjusting his robes. We will reconvene in 30 minutes for my ruling. He looked directly at Raphael. Use that time wisely. As the room emptied, Raphael remained seated, staring at the empty space where Isabella had been moments before. She'd risen without a word, walking out with Clara beside her, shoulders straight, head high. He didn't follow. Silence between them was comfortable, familiar. The kind that only exists between two people who've weathered storms together. Clara watched her for a long moment before speaking softly. You're not going back in there, are you? Isabella lifted the cup to her lips, steam warming her face. I have to. Do you? Clara turned slightly, voice gentle but probing. Or are you staying because you still think you owe him closure? Isabella's eyes flickered, just for a second, toward the courthouse doors. Maybe I owe myself one. Clara reached over, squeezing her hand. Then remember who you were before all this. Not Raphael's wife. Not the woman they tried to paint in court. Just you. And as if summoned by memory, Isabella's mind drifted, not to the penthouse, not to the courtroom, but to a sunlit kitchen 10 years ago, the morning after their wedding. She'd woken alone. Raphael had already left for an emergency call with Tokyo investors. But on the counter, beside a half-empty coffee cup, he'd left a note. Sorry I missed breakfast. Love you. She'd smiled then, folding the note into her wallet, carrying it like a talisman through months of lonely dinners and canceled anniversaries. She'd told herself it was enough, that love wasn't measured in time, but in intention. But now, sitting here, she realized something painful and true. Intention without action is just another kind of absence. Her father had known it all along. She remembered sitting with him on his porch the summer before she married Raphael. He'd been retired for 2 years, spending his days tending roses and reading poetry. She'd been glowing, full of dreams, showing him the engagement ring. He hadn't smiled right away. Instead, he'd taken her hand, his voice quiet. "Marry him if you must, mi corazon. But never confuse devotion with self-erasure. A good man doesn't ask you to disappear. He makes space for you to bloom." She hadn't understood then. She thought love meant sacrifice, that staying meant strength. Now she knew better. A breeze stirred the leaves above, scattering droplets onto her shoulders. She closed her eyes, letting the coolness wash over her. Inside the courthouse, the clock ticked toward the final hour. Soon, the judge would deliver his ruling. Assets would be divided, legacies rewritten. But none of that would change what had already been lost, or what had finally been found. Clara stood, brushing her coat. "Come on, let's go back in." Isabella nodded, rising slowly. As she did, her fingers brushed against the small locket at her throat, the one her father gave her on her 18th birthday. Inside, a faded photo of her mother, gone too soon, and a tiny slip of paper with 3 words written in her father's careful script. "Be your truth." She hadn't opened it in years. But today, she pressed it gently against her chest, feeling its weight like an anchor. Back inside, the hallway leading to courtroom 7 felt longer than before. Every step echoed. Reporters whispered near the door. Lawyers shuffled papers. And then ahead she saw him, Raphael, standing alone by a window, staring out at the city he'd built, looking smaller than she'd ever seen him. He turned as she approached. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then quietly, "I'm sorry, ISA. Not for the affair. Not for the money. Not for the legal maneuvering. Just for everything." She looked at him, not with bitterness, but with clarity. "Sorry doesn't rebuild what's broken, Raphael. But it's a start." He nodded, eyes glistening. "I don't expect forgiveness." "You shouldn't," she said gently. "But maybe you can learn to see people before they walk away." Before he could respond, the bailiff called from the courtroom door. "All parties, please take your seats." Isabella walked past him without hesitation. But as she stepped through the doorway, she paused, just for a breath, and glanced back. Not at Raphael. At the bench. Her father was already seated, robes crisp, expression neutral. But when their eyes met, he gave the faintest nod. The same one he'd given her on her first day of school, when she'd been too nervous to enter the classroom. "You've got this." She took her seat. Outside, the clouds parted fully now, sunlight pouring through the high windows like liquid gold. And somewhere deep inside, Isabella Mendez Almeida, daughter, woman, survivor, knew. Whatever came next, she would face it not as someone's wife, but as herself. Elsewhere, still caught in the echo of Isabella's words. "Sorry doesn't rebuild what's broken." Then, without warning, Vanessa's attorney stood. "Your Honor," he said, voice sharp with sudden urgency. "Before the court delivers its ruling, we submit new evidence, recently uncovered, that directly challenges Ms. Almeida's claim of financial transparency." A rustle swept through the room. Judge Mendez didn't move. "Proceed." The attorney approached the bench, handing over a sealed envelope. "Bank records from a private institution in Geneva. They show a series of transfers totaling $1.8 million from a shell company linked to Ms. Almeida's maiden name, Mendez Holdings, into an offshore account under her personal code." Isabella went very still. Raphael turned sharply toward her. "You had money?" She didn't answer. Her face had gone pale, but not with guilt, with recognition. Judge Mendez opened the file slowly, scanning the documents. His expression remained neutral, but his knuckles whitened around the paper's edge. "Ms. Almeida," he said after a long moment, "do you recognize these transactions?" "I do," she said, voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Even Clara gripped the armrests, eyes wide with disbelief. Raphael leaned forward, voice low and raw. "All this time, you preached integrity while hiding assets." Isabella finally looked at him, not defensively, but with sorrow so deep it silenced the room. "I didn't hide anything, Raphael. I protected something." "Your Honor," Vanessa's lawyer pressed. "This proves Ms. Almeida engaged in the very deception she accused Mr. Almeida of." She. Enough, the judge cut in, his voice like ice. He turned fully to Isabella. Explain. She took a slow breath. Mendez Holdings isn't mine. It belonged to my mother. She founded it before she died, funded women's shelters, literacy programs, medical aid for domestic violence survivors. After her passing, my father and I became trustees. The account in Geneva? It's not personal. It's a reserve fund, untouchable except in emergencies. She paused, then added quietly, 2 months ago, a shelter in Recife was threatened with closure. Staff hadn't been paid in weeks. Children were sleeping on floors. I authorized a transfer to keep it open. Silence. But why not use your own accounts? Raphael asked, confusion cutting through his anger. Because your legal team froze all joint assets the day you filed for divorce, she said simply. And my personal funds were tied up in your restructuring. So I used the only resource left, the one that wasn't yours to control. Judge Mendez removed his glasses slowly. Did you document the transfer as a loan from the trust? Yes, with full board approval. Signed affidavits. Everything. He turned to Vanessa's lawyer. Were these documents included in your evidence? The man hesitated. No, Your Honor. Then you presented incomplete records to mislead this court. The judge's voice dropped dangerously low. That's not advocacy. That's obstruction. Vanessa shot to her feet. I didn't know. My lawyer. Sit down, Ms. Costa, the judge commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. He looked at the attorney. You will submit the full file within the hour. If it contradicts your client's claims, I will refer this matter to the Bar Association and possibly federal authorities. The lawyer paled. Understood, Your Honor. Isabella remained seated, but her shoulders relaxed slightly. She hadn't flinched, hadn't raised her voice. She'd simply spoken truth into the storm and watched it part. Raphael stared at her, realization dawning like sunrise through fog. All this time, while he'd been building empires, she'd been quietly holding up broken worlds. And when he tried to take even that from her legacy, her mother's work, she'd fought not for herself, but for strangers who had no one else. He turned to his own lawyer, voice hollow. Drop every claim against her. Now. But the assets. Now, Raphael repeated, sharper this time. From the bench, Judge Mendez watched them both, then spoke softly, so only those closest could hear. You spent weeks trying to prove she was selfish, he said, looking at Vanessa, then Raphael, while she was using her last resources to feed children you never knew existed. He straightened his robes. This court values truth over theatrics. And today, truth wore a quiet face. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, not threatening but cleansing. Restroom, needing air that didn't taste like judgment. But before she reached the door, a familiar voice cut through the corridor's quiet. Still playing the martyr, I see. Vanessa stood beneath the arched alcove near the water fountain, arms crossed, lips curled in a brittle imitation of confidence. Her ivory suit was slightly rumpled now, her hair less perfect, but her eyes burned with something desperate, cornered, wounded, dangerous. Isabella stopped, didn't turn fully, just stood there, back straight, shoulders calm. You think hiding behind charity makes you noble? Vanessa hissed, stepping closer. You used your dead mother's name to launder your guilt. Don't pretend it was for the children. It was for you, to feel clean while he walked all over you. Isabella finally turned. Not with anger, not with defensiveness. Just clarity. You're scared, she said softly. Vanessa flinched. Of what? You? No, Isabella said, taking one step forward. Of realizing you gave everything, your dignity, your integrity, for a man who never saw you either. Vanessa's breath hitched. At least I fought for what I wanted. And what did you want? Isabella asked, voice gentle but unyielding. His money? His name? Or just proof that someone like him could choose you over someone like me? The question hung between them like glass about to shatter. Vanessa's mask cracked. You had everything, she whispered, voice trembling. Beauty, status, security. And you just let it go, like it meant nothing. It meant everything, Isabella said quietly. But not because of him. Because it was mine. My love. My loyalty. My choice. She looked at Vanessa, really looked at her. Not as a rival, but as another woman lost in the same storm. You mistook possession for love. And now you're angry because you realize he never loved you. He just needed you to believe he did. Vanessa's eyes filled with tears she refused to shed. You don't know anything about me. I know you're tired, Isabella said. I know you've spent your life trying to prove you're worthy of a seat at tables built by men who'll never truly see you. I know because I almost became you." Vanessa stared at her, stunned. "But I chose differently," Isabella continued. "Not because I'm better, but because my father taught me that worth isn't earned through conquest, it's claimed through truth." She took another step, close enough now that Vanessa could see the faint lines around her eyes, the ones carved by years of silent endurance. "You don't have to keep fighting," Isabella said. "Not like this. Not for scraps of attention from someone who only values what he can control." Vanessa opened her mouth, to retort, to deny, to lash out, but no words came. Instead, her shoulders slumped just slightly, and for the first time, she looked not cunning, not cruel, but young, exhausted, human. Isabella reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small card. She held it out. "What's this?" Vanessa asked, wary. "A women's legal aid center. They help people like us, women rebuilding after giving too much to men who gave too little." She offered a faint smile. No judgment, just support. Vanessa didn't take it right away. But she didn't walk away either. From down the hall, the bailiff's voice called, "Parties to the courtroom, please." Isabella nodded once. "Think about it." As she turned to leave, Vanessa's voice stopped her, barely above a whisper. "Did he ever say my name when he was with you?" Isabella paused. Looked back. "No," she said honestly. "He barely said mine." And with that, she walked away, not in triumph, but in peace. Behind her, Vanessa stood alone in the emptying corridor, the card still in her hand, staring at it like it might burn or bless her. Inside the courtroom, Raphael watched Isabella return, her expression serene, her step steady. He didn't speak. Didn't need to. Because in that moment, he understood. She hadn't just won the case. She'd reclaimed her soul. And no amount of money, no grand gesture, no last-minute plea could ever bring spoke. His voice was calm. But beneath it thrummed something deeper, older. The weight of a father who had watched his daughter endure too much for too long. "Before I deliver my final ruling," he began, "I must address a matter of record." He turned his gaze toward Vanessa's attorney, who stiffened instantly. "The so-called evidence you submitted regarding offshore transfers has been reviewed in full. The complete documentation, signed by the Mendez Family Trust Board, notarized and compliant with international fiduciary law, confirms Ms. Almeida's account in every detail." He paused, letting the implication settle. "Therefore," he continued, "your attempt to frame charitable disbursements as asset concealment constitutes a deliberate misrepresentation of facts. This court will not tolerate such tactics. A formal reprimand will be filed with the state bar, and if similar conduct occurs in any future proceeding, disbarment will be recommended." Vanessa's lawyer opened his mouth to protest, but one look from the judge silenced him. Then, without warning, the judge turned fully to Raphael. "Mr. Almeida," he said, voice low but resonant, "you claimed your wife was emotionally absent. Yet financial records show she personally funded your mother's in-home care for 18 months after her dementia diagnosis, while you were abroad closing deals. You said she contributed nothing to your legacy. Yet she declined public recognition for the children's hospital wing you now use in your corporate branding." Raphael's throat tightened. He couldn't speak. "You built an empire," the judge went on, "but you forgot to build a home. And when your mistress betrayed you, you came here expecting the law to punish your wife for your own neglect." A murmur rippled through the room. From the corner of his eye, Raphael saw Isabella, still, composed, eyes fixed on the floor. But he knew her well enough to see the tension in her jaw, the slight tremor in her hands. She wasn't enjoying this. She never wanted it. And that made it worse. The judge leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a near-intimate register that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "Let me ask you this, Mr. Almeida. When was the last time you asked your wife how she was? Not as a formality, but because you truly wanted to know?" Raphael's breath caught. He remembered the last time. It was over a year ago. She'd been sitting on the terrace, staring at the city lights, and he'd called out, "You okay?" without looking up from his tablet. She'd said, "Fine," and he'd gone back to his emails. He hadn't asked again. "I don't remember," he admitted, voice rough. The judge nodded slowly. "That's the tragedy. Not the divorce. Not the money. The silence between two people who once promised to never let each other disappear." Then, turning to Vanessa, his tone shifted, cooler, sharper. "And you, Ms. Costa, you entered this marriage like a scavenger, picking at the bones of someone else's love, convinced that if you took enough pieces, you'd become whole. He shook his head. But you can't build a life on stolen foundations. Vanessa looked down, her earlier defiance gone, replaced by something raw and exposed. Judge Mendez sat back, exhaling slowly. This case was never about assets. It was about accountability, about seeing clearly what we've chosen to ignore. He glanced at Isabella, just once, and in that look past everything, pride, sorrow, love. Then, with quiet finality, he said, "Now, I will deliver my ruling." Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, not threatening, but cleansing. And inside, 3 lives stood on the edge of reckoning, not with gavels or, "You think you're so pure?" she spat, stepping forward despite the bailiff's warning glance. "You sat there for years while he ignored you, humiliated you, gave your life to strangers. And you never fought. You just disappeared. And now you want everyone to believe you're some saint? No, you're just weak. And weakness doesn't deserve reward." A gasp rippled through the gallery. Raphael stiffened, but before he could speak, Judge Mendez slammed his gavel once, sharp, final. "Ms. Costa," he said, voice low but laced with steel, "you will address the court, not launch personal attacks." But Vanessa wasn't listening. Tears welled in her eyes, not of remorse, but of fury. At herself, at him, at the world that had taught her that love was something to be seized, not given. She didn't even try to keep him. Vanessa cried, voice cracking. "She let me walk right in. If she'd screamed, if she'd fought, if she'd made a scene, maybe he would have stayed. But she just vanished. And now she gets to play the victim?" Isabella didn't flinch. She simply looked at Vanessa, not with pity, not with anger, but with a sorrow so deep it felt like grace. "I didn't vanish," she said quietly, standing now, her voice carrying through the stunned silence. "I stayed. Every day. Through his absences, his distractions, his silence. I stayed because I believed in the man I married, not the ghost he became." She took a step forward, calm, unshaken. "And when you came into our home, I didn't fight you because I knew, deep down, that if his love could be taken so easily, it was never really mine to begin with." Vanessa's breath hitched. "That's just words." "No," Isabella said, softer now. "It's truth. And truth doesn't need volume to be heard." Before Vanessa could respond, Judge Mendez stood. "That is enough." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It carried the weight of a lifetime spent upholding justice, and the quiet fury of a father watching his daughter endure one final indignity. He stepped down from the bench, not in violation of protocol, but with deliberate, measured authority, and walked slowly around the front of the dais until he stood between the 2 women. He looked at Vanessa, his eyes hard but not cruel. "You confuse strength with noise, Ms. Costa. You believe that to be seen, you must shout. But real strength." He glanced at Isabella. "Real strength is choosing dignity when cruelty would be easier." Then, turning fully to face the room, he spoke with solemn clarity. "This court will not tolerate character assassination disguised as testimony. Ms. Almeida has endured enough. Any further attempts to demean her integrity will be treated as contempt." Vanessa finally sank back into her seat, trembling, her earlier bravado shattered. She looked not at Isabella, but at her hands, as if seeing them for the first time. The nails too sharp, the rings too flashy, the gestures too rehearsed. Raphael watched it all, heart pounding not with fear, but with shame. He had let this happen. He had created the vacuum that Vanessa rushed to fill. He had made Isabella feel invisible, and then punished her for not fighting louder to be seen. And now, in this courtroom, stripped of wealth, status, and illusion, he saw the unbearable truth. Isabella hadn't lost him. He had lost himself, and taken her for granted while doing it. Judge Mendez returned to the bench, his expression unreadable once more. But as he adjusted his robes, his fingers lingered for just a second on the edge of the wood, anchoring himself, perhaps, against the storm of emotion he was sworn to contain. Outside, rain began to fall again, soft at first, then steady, washing the city clean. And inside, the air crackled with the electric hush before judgment falls. Not just legal judgment, but moral reckoning. Silence, anticipation, dread, the unbearable weight of truth about to be spoken aloud. Judge Mendez sat perfectly still for a long moment, hands folded on the bench, eyes lowered as if in prayer. Then, without looking up, he spoke, quietly, deliberately, each word measured like a stone placed on sacred ground. "Before I deliver my final ruling," he began, "there is a matter of full disclosure that must be addressed, not for legal necessity, but for moral clarity." He paused. lifted his gaze, and looked directly at Isabella. I am Isabella Mendez Almeida's father. A collective intake of breath swept through the room. Raphael's head snapped up. Vanessa froze mid-fidget. Even the bailiff straightened, eyes wide. The judge continued, voice steady but layered with something deeper: regret, resolve, love. I recused myself from no fewer than 3 prior cases involving Mr. Almeida's corporate entities once I learned my daughter was married to him. I maintained strict professional distance throughout this proceeding. Every ruling, every question, every intervention has been grounded in law, not loyalty. He turned slightly toward Raphael, then Vanessa. But when Ms. Costa chose to attack my daughter's character, not her finances, not her legal standing, but her worth, as if her quiet dignity were weakness, I could no longer pretend this was merely a case file on my desk. His voice dropped, low enough that only those in the front rows could catch its tremor. She is my child, the woman who held my wife's hand as she took her last breath. The girl who stayed up all night helping me grade law exams when I was grieving. The person who never asked for protection, but deserved it anyway. He looked at Isabella now, and for the first time, the mask of the judge slipped, just enough to reveal the father beneath. I did not shield her, he said softly. I let her stand, and she stood with more grace than any of us deserve. Isabella's eyes filled, but she didn't look away. She simply nodded, once, acknowledging not just the words, but the lifetime of love behind them. Raphael sat stunned, heart hammering. He'd suspected, yes, but hearing it confirmed, spoken with. Such raw honesty in this courtroom shattered something in him. He hadn't just disrespected a wife. He'd failed a daughter in the eyes of the man who raised her, the man who now held his fate in his hands. Vanessa stared at the floor, her earlier defiance gone. She had assumed Isabella was alone, that she had no one to defend her. But she'd been wrong. She'd always been wrong. Judge Mendez straightened, reclaiming his judicial composure, but the warmth in his eyes remained. This revelation changes nothing legally, he said firmly, but it explains everything humanly. And if any party believes this constitutes bias, I invite you to review every transcript, every ruling, every motion. You will find fairness, not favor. He paused, then added, voice quieter. Sometimes justice isn't blind. Sometimes it sees clearly and chooses compassion anyway. A long silence followed. No one moved. No one spoke. Outside, the rain slowed. A sliver of sunlight broke through the clouds, catching the edge of the judge's gavel like a promise. Then, slowly, Judge Mendez reached for his ruling. But before he could speak, Isabella rose. Your Honor, she said, voice clear despite the tears glistening in her eyes. Thank you for seeing me. Not as a plaintiff, not as a victim, but as your daughter. He looked at her, and for a heartbeat, the courtroom vanished. It was just father and child, years of unspoken love finally given voice. Then he nodded, once, and the judge returned. Wronged husband, the betrayed billionaire, the man entitled to walk away clean while reshaping his life with new assets and fewer complications. But now, watching Isabella stand beside her father, not triumphant, not vengeful, but seen, he felt something crack open inside his chest. Not regret. Not yet, but the first true tremor of self-recognition. He remembered the night he proposed to her. They'd been on a rooftop in Lisbon, the Tagus River glittering below, and she'd said yes before he even finished the sentence. He'd laughed, swept her into his arms, whispered, "You're my forever." And for years, he'd believed he'd kept that promise. Because he provided, he protected, he never raised his voice. But love wasn't in the grand gestures he performed for the world. It was in the quiet moments he'd missed. The way she bit her lip when she was nervous, the soft hum she made when reading, the exact shade of gold in her eyes when sunlight hit them just right. He hadn't just drifted. He'd chosen to look away. And now, in this sterile courtroom filled with strangers, Raphael Almeida finally saw what he'd thrown away. Not a possession, not a status symbol, but a woman who loved him with a depth he'd mistaken for silence. His lawyer nudged him gently. "We need to prepare for the ruling. Asset division, reputation management." Raphael held up a hand. "No," the lawyer blinked. "No, I don't care about the money," Raphael said, voice rough. "Not anymore." He turned slightly, watching Isabella as she sat back down, her fingers lightly touching the locket at her throat. The one her mother gave her, the one she never took off. He'd bought her diamonds worth millions, but she'd always worn that simple silver chain. He'd never asked why. Now he knew. It wasn't jewelry. It was anchor. From the bench, Judge Mendez began reading the ruling. fair, precise, legally unassailable. The penthouse would be sold, proceeds divided equally. The offshore accounts linked to Raphael's name would be audited. Vanessa's claims dismissed with prejudice. Isabella's charitable trust fully exonerated. But Raphael barely heard the terms. All he saw was her. The way her shoulders relaxed when her father spoke her full name. Isabella Mendez Almeida, as if reminding the world she existed before him, beyond him, apart from him. The way she didn't gloat when Vanessa flinched at the mention of federal referral. The way she looked out the window, not at him, as if already walking toward a future he wasn't part of. And that was the cruelest truth of all. She wasn't waiting for him to change. She'd already moved on. His hands trembled in his lap. Hands that signed billion-dollar deals, that held mistresses, that pushed away the one person who never asked for anything but his presence. He thought of the voicemails she'd left him over the years, soft, hesitant, always ending with "call me when you can." He'd deleted them without listening, assuming they were trivial. Now he wondered, had she been saying goodbye in pieces, hoping he'd notice before it was too late? Probably. And he hadn't. A tear slipped down his cheek, silent, shameful. He didn't wipe it away. Because for the first time in his life, Raphael Almeida understood. Wealth couldn't buy back time. Power couldn't restore trust. And no amount of success meant anything if you lost yourself, and the person who loved you enough to stay, along the way. Outside, the rain had stopped. Sunlight poured through the high windows, catching dust motes in golden swirls. Heritable trust fully exonerated, its integrity affirmed in writing for the public record. But none of it mattered, not really. What mattered was the silence between them now. Not the courtroom's hush, but the deeper quiet that had grown between two people who once shared a life. Raphael watched Isabella gather her papers, her movements calm, deliberate, as if she were packing away not just documents, but years of hope. He stood abruptly, chair scraping against marble. "ISA," he said, voice raw. She paused but didn't turn. "Please," he continued, stepping closer, ignoring the curious glances from lawyers and reporters. "Let me explain." She turned then slowly and looked at him. Not with anger. Not with pity. Just clarity. "There's nothing to explain, Raphael," she said softly. "You showed me who you were every day. I just refused to believe it until now." He flinched. "I can change. I want to change." "Maybe you do," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "But I'm not your redemption project. And I won't wait around to see if you become the man I married." He reached out instinctively, as if to touch her arm, but stopped himself inches away. "What do you want from me?" Her eyes held his steady, sad final. "Nothing. That's the point. I don't need your money. I don't need your apologies. I just need you to stop pretending that love is something you can reclaim like a lost asset." A beat of silence. Rain began again outside, soft taps against the high windows. From the bench, Judge Mendez watched them both, his expression unreadable, but his fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the desk. Then quietly he spoke, not as a judge, but as a father who'd seen enough. "Mr. Almeida," he said, "you've spent this entire proceeding trying to control the outcome. But some things can't be negotiated. Some losses aren't financial." He paused. "You had a good woman. You didn't cherish her. Now she's walking away. No court can force her to stay. No fortune can buy her back." Raphael swallowed hard, throat tight. "I know. Do you?" the judge pressed, voice low. "Because if you truly did, you wouldn't be asking what she wants. You'd be asking yourself what kind of man you'll be when she's gone." The words landed like stones in still water. Isabella took a slow breath. "I'm not punishing you, Raphael. I'm freeing myself. And maybe that's the gift you never knew I needed to give myself." She turned to leave. "ISA," he called out, desperation cracking his voice. She stopped at the doorway, back to him. "Yes. Will I ever see you again?" She didn't turn. Didn't hesitate. "Only if you learn to see me first." And with that, she walked out, heels clicking softly against the stone floor, each step a quiet declaration of independence. Raphael stood alone in the center of the emptied courtroom, the echo of her footsteps fading like a heartbeat growing distant. Judge Mendez rose slowly, removing his robes. As he passed Raphael, he paused, just for a second. "You still have a choice," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "You can rebuild your empire, or rebuild yourself. But you can't do both at the same time." Then he too walked away, leaving Raphael standing in the ruins of everything he thought he owned. Outside, the city buzzed on, indifferent. But inside, for the first time in his life, Rafael Almeida understood. Or trusts, just lines, shapes, the curve of a leaf, the arc of a bird in flight. Small things. True things. She wore no rings now. No designer coat. Just a soft sweater the color of dawn and jeans that had seen better days. And for the first time in years, she felt light. Clara found her there, carrying 2 paper cups of tea. "You're avoiding my calls," Clara said, sitting beside her with a knowing smile. Isabella didn't look up. Not avoiding. Just breathing. Clara handed her a cup. "He's been asking about you." Isabella's hand stilled over the page. "Rafael? Who else?" Clara sighed. "He sold the penthouse. Donated half the proceeds to the Recife shelter. The one you saved. He's stepping back from the board. Taking time off." Isabella finally looked up, eyes searching. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I think you should know he's trying." "Trying what?" Isabella asked softly. "To fix me? To win me back? Or just to ease his conscience?" "I don't know," Clara admitted. "But he visited your father last week." That surprised her. She set the journal down. "Dad didn't tell me." "He wouldn't," Clara said gently. "But he told me." Said Rafael came not as a billionaire, but as a man who finally understood what he'd lost. Isabella stared at the steam curling from her cup. Memories surfaced, not of arguments or absences, but of small moments. Rafael laughing at her terrible cooking, holding her hand during a thunderstorm, the way his eyes softened when he thought she wasn't looking. "I loved him," she whispered. "Not the empire. Not the name. Him. The man beneath all that noise." "Then why walk away?" Clara asked. "Because love shouldn't require me to disappear," Isabella said, voice steady. "And staying would have meant pretending his change was enough, when I needed to prove to myself that I was enough on my own." She closed her journal. Looked out at the garden, lush, resilient, thriving even in shadow. "I'm not waiting for him to become someone new," she said. "I'm becoming someone true." Later that evening, as dusk painted the sky in shades of violet and gold, Isabella stood on the balcony of her small apartment, the one with the fire escape and the view of laundry lines and rooftop cats. She held a single envelope in her hands. No return address. Just her name, written in a hand she hadn't seen in months. She didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, she placed it on the windowsill, next to a potted jasmine plant she'd bought the day she left the penthouse. Inside, the note read, "ISA, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I'm learning to see, not just you, but myself. If you ever want to talk, I'll be here. Not as the man I was. As the one I'm trying to become. R." She touched the paper lightly, then stepped back inside, closing the window against the evening chill. She didn't throw it away. She didn't keep it. Close. She simply let it be, a possibility, not a promise. Because healing wasn't about going back. It was about moving forward, with eyes open, heart whole, and no more apologies for taking up space. And somewhere across the city, Rafael sat alone in a modest rented flat, staring at a blank wall, not building empires, not chasing deals, but learning slowly, painfully, how to be present. Not for her. Eyed as a child, where he'd taught her to plant roses, where he'd held her the night her mother died. Now the air was warm, birdsong weaving through the trees like threads of hope. She found him on the old wooden bench beneath the fig tree, reading poetry, Rilke, his favorite. He looked up as she approached, eyes crinkling at the corners in that quiet way that meant "I'm glad you're here" without needing words. She sat beside him, not speaking at first. Just breathing. Just being. After a while, he closed the book and set it aside. "You've been quiet lately." "I've been thinking," she said, tracing the grain of the bench with her fingertips. "About what comes next." "And," she smiled faintly, "I turned down the board position at the foundation." He nodded, unsurprised. "You never wanted power. You wanted purpose." "Exactly." She turned to him. "I'm starting something new. A small center, counseling, legal aid, safe housing, for women rebuilding after men like Rafael." He studied her face, seeing not just his daughter, but the woman she'd become. Scarred, yes, but unbroken. Wiser. Kinder, to others and finally to herself. "He's changed, you know," her father said quietly. "I know," she replied. "He volunteers at the shelter now. Listens more than he speaks. Doesn't mention his name unless asked. A good start. But not enough," she finished softly. "Not for us. Maybe not ever." Her father reached over, covering her hand with his, wrinkled, steady, the hand that had held hers through every storm. You don't owe him a second chance, ISA. You only owe yourself peace. Tears welled but didn't fall. I used to think love meant staying. Now I know it sometimes means walking away so both people can find who they're meant to be. He squeezed her hand. Your mother would be proud of you. Isabella leaned her head on his shoulder, just like she did when she was small. I miss her. I know, mi vida. But she's in you. In your kindness. Your courage. Your refusal to let bitterness take root. They sat in silence as the sun dipped lower, casting long golden shadows across the garden. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughed. A breeze stirred the leaves above, scattering petals like blessings. Later, as twilight deepened, Isabella stood to leave. Her father rose too, slower now, but still strong. Will you visit again soon? He asked. Every Sunday, she promised. Like always. He kissed her forehead, the way he had since she was 5. Go live your life, my girl. Not the one they wrote for you. The one you choose. She walked back through the garden gate, past the roses she'd helped him prune last week, past the jasmine climbing the stone wall, fragrant, resilient, blooming even in shade. And as she stepped onto the quiet street, phone buzzing in her pocket, a message from Clara about the new center's opening, a note from a former client saying, "You saved me." Isabella didn't look back. Because she wasn't running anymore. She was returning to herself. Not Raphael's wife. Not a victim. Not even just a survivor. But Isabella Mendez, whole, free, and finally gloriously enough. And in that truth, she found something rarer than wealth, deeper than passion, stronger than any courtroom verdict.